everyone, and welcome to my talk, Angular and Jest, Testing Titbits. I've prepared some use cases from my project experience that I'd like to share with you. Testing can be immensely complicated, so I don't think that it's possible to master every single aspect of testing after seeing this presentation, but at least you will see some things that are possible. So next time when you have to test your application, you know where to start. Let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Korneeva. During the day, I work as front-end technology lead for a company called Aleri. We're based in Germany and provide digital solutions for e-commerce. And during the night, I prepare my conference talks and write for ng-conf. You can find my articles on Medium. If you have any questions or feedback regarding today's topic or just want to connect, feel free to drop a line via Twitter, LinkedIn, or email. So let's start. What do I cover today in my talk? I will briefly talk about why you need testing. No worries, really briefly, because either you are really convinced that testing is necessary or you do not attend reliable Web Summit, right? I'll focus on Jest unit tests for Angular applications, and I'll show some code snippets for the most common scenarios. Though the target group of this talk is rather less advanced developers, no worries, the tidbits will be spicy enough for everyone. What I do not cover, however, is the setup of Jest. Because if you have just one project, it's really easy to set up. There are tons of tutorials how to do this. If you have a monorepo and you use some tools such as Lerna or NX, they will do it for you, so it's also quite easy. And if you have a monorepo and if you want to do it by yourself, then I think we need the whole bootcamp dedicated to this topic. Oh, and I don't cover end-to-end pen tests, integration tests, user acceptance tests, any other types of tests, because one just needs to stop somewhere. So let's get started. Why testing? In case if you as a developer are already convinced that you need to write some tests, let's have a look at the whole story from the business perspective. You either ship features or write tests, right? Let's think about software development as baking a cake. Each day you bake and ship thousands or maybe even billions of cakes to your customers. Once they're on their side, you have no control over them. So you have to make sure that those cakes are not poisonous. Then it's better to taste one than to compensate for sick customers. You have to make sure that there are some controls in your baking process that assure quality and compliance. When you bake some custom cakes, defining the test criteria might help you to clarify your requirements, especially with test-driven development. Suddenly you realize that you need 3D standing figures on the cake instead of 2D images. Imagine that there is a tough competition in your cake market. Your market research found out that if your cakes were rainbow colored, you could finally achieve the breakthrough. However, your competition wants to do the same. So you have to bake and ship as quick as possible. How do you make sure that the new color of the topping wouldn't interfere with the dough of your cake? German even have a word for this, which is verschlimmbessern, meaning making something worse while trying to improve. Before we dig into the code, let's briefly talk about some general testing strategy. First of all, you have to have a testing strategy. Testing somewhat and somehow isn't helpful at all. Last year, my team started to talk about these topics, and we found out that we have a very different understanding of what's and how's. Let's face it, by no testing means you can prove that your software is bug-free. So you should use your resources strategically and pragmatically. Test the critical features first, not your getters and setters. You shouldn't test neither the Angular implementation nor your own. The test that you see has no business relevance. Even worse are the tests that never fail. You should design for failure to be able to protect against it. It should fail when this and that, so that we should do this and that. And the last but not least, we're coming to our unit tests. To make sure that the whole system works properly, we have to be sure that each element works correctly. Only when we have this ground, we can build upon it and interconnect things. Make sure you mock away everything which is not the core functionality of the subject under test. Components, services, modules, pipes, directives, whatever, as you can see in the picture. But maybe I should have even mocked away the just showcase sleep module too. To mock or not to mock, that's actually a very good question. There are a couple of very good resources that I linked to the repository for this talk. I like the idea of Justin Searles that says that mocking too much might be even a code smell indicating that our components or services are not split correctly. Anyway, mocking is our friend during testing. According to some developers, there is a slight difference in the meaning between those concepts, but it is not relevant for the practical purpose of having a controlled yet realistic testing environment. But again, feel free to look it up in the resource section in the README file. Creating a realistic yet controlled environment for our tests is the mantra of test doubles. Make sure that you do not mix your mocking strategies and mock, let's say, every second service, because otherwise you might lose this controlled part of it. You should also make sure that your mocks and original implementation interfaces stay in sync, because otherwise you might lose the realistic part of it. And finally, be careful with no error schema, because what's the sense of a test if you silence some of the errors? So let's have a look at the application that we want to test. It has an app component, which has two child components. The one which is called age component and the price component. The app component has a button which leads us to the Jest documentation website. And there is another button, and if we press it, we see that the price in the price component gets increased. And if we keep pressing, then we see also some opinion regarding this price. In the age component, we can enter the name, and then the request goes to the API, which calculates your age based on the name. So don't ask me about the business value of this application. It's just a bunch of methods that we want to test during this talk. Let's have a look at the code. We have apps and libs according to the NX workspace structure. In the apps, I have Just Showcase app, and in the libs, I have Just Showcase lib. And as I've mentioned before, our app component has two child components, age component and price component. I have also some app service in here and a pipe and some utils. So I try to add some bunch of stuff that looks nearly as the real world project. And then I have in here just one service, which is being used consumed by the Showcase app. Let's jump straight into the code. We'll start with our mocks. You probably already know how to spy on some methods. In our case, we have getHighPrice that returns the results of increased price. Normally, you would write something like jest.spyOn your service and the method that you would like to spy on. And then you just call the method under test and make sure that your spy have been called with the arguments that you want to test. But wait a second, our increased price has no service because that's a pure function. So how do we spy on this? We have to provide the named import, and then we use this name in here and place our pure function in here. So it still works. Jest also allows you for generous interface testing. Let's say you have a getAge method. If there is a name, then it fetches data from your backend API and then extracts some information from it. So far, so good. Extract H information requires an object as a parameter which has specific properties. You can test explicitly for those properties. So in this case, what you can do is you specify the mock H result as usual. You mock return value for your fetch H call, and since this is an asynchronous call that returns a promise, you resolve it with your mock result. You spy on the internal method, you specify the name so that we come in. We call the method under test. We have to check through, since this is an asynchronous method. I'll come to this later. And then you can test explicitly for the properties of the object that your spy has been called with. You can even specify further expectations on them. I've shown to you how to check for parameters that our spy has been called with. You've also seen how to test for particular properties of those parameters. For the sake of completeness, let's have a look how to test that our spy hasn't been called at all. So with the same method, you don't provide any name, you call getAge. You put not in front of to have been called to negate the expectation to test if your spy has been called. But again, testing if some internal methods have been called goes too much into the direction of testing internal implementation, which is not a good idea. So maybe you should better test for external effects. For example, if this extract H information should update some edge property, maybe you should check if the properties stayed the same. Let's have a look at another scenario. In this case, we have a pipe that extends a currency pipe and performs some transformation of our input. We want to have a euro sign and added to our price. In our getPrice tag, we get some price result from our app service. We increase it and transform it with our pipe. So how do you test it? Usually you could mock return value of your transform method. However, as you can see, this method is overloaded, so TypeScript doesn't know which declaration to take. So what you can do is to specify a type of function, cast your transform as this type to help TypeScript to identify which is the correct set of parameters and the return value. Then you call your method as usual, tick through this since it's an asynchronous one, and expect whatever you want to expect. Mocks are of great help if you want to isolate your subject under test. So you can mock away some methods of the service that your component depends on to shift the focus on the component itself. In this particular implementation, you take just a partial of your service which is relevant for your component and mock just some of those methods. However, this is not a solution that I'd like to recommend because you're distorting the reality for the sake of control. Once we've learned how to spy on methods and mock stuff, let's briefly talk about some nuances of expectations. When you test some values, you can use to equal, to be, or to be true thing. What is the difference between those expectations? Let's say we have a very simple method. It's always truthy that returns true. Actually, it shouldn't be tested and shouldn't be written like this in the real world. But anyway, for the sake of presentation, we test this method, and if we say it's equal to true, it returns true. It also returns true because it is true, and it is also truthy. If we have a similar method that returns a non-empty string, then it equals to the same string. It is the same string. It is also truthy because, as you know, the non-empty string is truthy. So now we have another method which returns an object with some key and some value. In our test, we expect this returned object to be equal to our mocked object with some key and some value, and this is true. But then we can specify another object which has also some key and some value, but another property, some undefined key with the undefined value. And this is important that this value is undefined. And if we compare them, then it returns also true that our SumKey_SumValue object is equal to the mocked object with the undefined property. That shouldn't be. So if you want this test to fail, you have to use toStrictEqual. If you don't want this test to fail, you put a not in front of it. To be also enforces the strict equality. So for this test to pass, we have to expect the returned object not to be the mocked object. Once we've clarified some underlying concepts, let's move on to some common scenarios. What I didn't know myself is that you can actually provide your test arguments in a table or in an array so that they all are tested through and compared to the expected value. Well, testing this particular method might not be reasonable. The real case scenario would be to test your inputs. For example, if you have a field with email validation, you can provide some email inputs and the expected validation results. It totally makes sense to do this in the unit test and not in the end-to-end testing, just because unit tests are really much faster. Another common scenario is to test child components with inputs. In our case, we have a price component with a price input. When the price changes, it performs some transformation upon it and updates the price tag. To test it, you can wrap your component under test in a parent component. You mock the implementation of the transform method of the EuroPipe. You reference the component under test from your parent component and change the price. You have to call the ng-on-changes method by yourself because Jest doesn't do it for you. You have to call detect changes for the template to be updated. And then you can test if the price tag has been updated and if the updated price tag has been displayed in the template. Testing HTTP requests is extremely important because this is something that usually is out of your control. Let's start with a simple GET request. It appends a name parameter and returns the default age if an error occurs. To test this method, you have to subscribe to it because otherwise the HTTP request wouldn't be fired. Then you can expect one request to be made. And you can check for body, parameters, headers, response style, URL with parameters, with credentials, report progress tag, method, etc. as you like. And only then you flash the mocked result. Then the result comes into the subscription, and then you can expect your edge result to equal the mocked result. You should always take care about error handling when dealing with HTTP requests. And so you should also test your error handling. To test this method, you also have to subscribe. You expect a request to be made. You check for some aspects of this request, and then you flash an error response instead of successful data. Your error response should be of type HTTP error response to mock the real behavior of the web with some error codes and status text. Let's spice it up a little bit. Let's say you have to get some parameters for your HTTP requests first. And let's say your method to get those is asynchronous, so you have to await it. I also changed the return type to promise because otherwise you would return an observable of a promise of a value. The test is pretty similar to the previous scenario, except that you have to use fake async and tick to step through the asynchronous execution. So when we call tick in here, we just move in front of this return statement. Now we can expect our request to be made as usual, check for some aspects of this request, flash the data, and come into the closure. There is an alternative syntax for this test. We get our promise by calling the fetchAge method. We tick through this. We are again in front of this return statement. We make our request. We expect some aspects of this request to take place, to be true. We flash the result, and then we wait for the promise that we got in here to resolve as expected. When working with Angular components, you have an HTML template too, so that you can test if the user interaction with some DOM elements triggers the right methods and is being properly handled by the component methods. Let's say we have a button and it triggers the method increase price when you click on it. The increase price does nothing special, just increases the price. To test it, you need a spy of the method that is being called, the reference to the button. Then you click on the button and check if the spy is being called. You can get the reference to the button by using fixture, debug element, native element, and query selectors. If you have more than one button in your template, you can use query selector all and take the respective element, or you can use the selection syntax and use button nth child. Please note, this might be not the best way to implement button click tests. You are mocking away some part of the component under tests. Maybe you should better aim at the side effects that your button click produces. So maybe you should better check if the button click really increases the price, because actually you do not care which method increases it. Finally, we can see some test execution in action. If you want to test your application, you can just write ng-test just showcase app, place your app here, then you see all the files, all the tests have been run. If you want to test your lib, you can do this the same way. Here we have just one file. In case you want to test just a single file, then you have this option too. So you can run ng-test and then test file as a flag, and then you just say which file you would like to run. If you want to rerun tests after each change to the related files, you can use ng-test watch option. It will give you several options to choose. For now, we will go with the P option, starting so that we can enter the file name or the regex. And again, as you see, it does exactly the same with the nice option of focusing on just one test. So if I place F in front of my test that I'd like to focus on and save the changes, Jest will rerun just this one test. Again, I have another option. I can say Jest should skip this one. Well, Jest can skip this one too, but this time we will use a slightly different syntax. Yeah, well, there's nothing to test. The tests don't fail. But I am actually a lazy person, so I've installed a plugin called Jest Runner. So I will just comment it back. And what it allows me to do, when I skip the watch option, I can just decide by myself what I want to run. So if I'm working on this file, I can run all the tests, or I can also say that I want to run just this one. Feel free to discover this repository and to look into the spec files, because I was not able to cover every single use case. So you might find something useful for you. That's all for today. Enjoy your testing. And if you have any further questions or feedback, feel free to drop a line and contact me via Twitter, LinkedIn, or email. Thank you for your attention and have a nice day.
Hey, it's Joe Eames with ng-conf. If you like that video, be sure to click subscribe either here or here, somewhere over here. And if you're looking for something more, here's another video for you to watch here or there or somewhere.